Well, we've all been children, and many of us are parents, so we tend to assume that we know what childhood is. I'm not going to waste time trying to define childhood, but the point is that it's a cultural invention. It varies from place to place, across historical time, from different cultures. I'm going to be talking about it from a Western perspective tonight. But the social institution of childhood mustn't be confused with biological immaturity. Immaturity is a fact of nature. For instance, the fact that small children are as yet unable to control their bladder. We have different ways of dealing with that. But more complex, deeper things like, do we consider children as competent and resilient, or do we consider them vulnerable and they need tying in and restricting and protecting? These all affect the childhood that you experience. So what shapes a culture's attitudes and beliefs in childhood? The things that we think we know about children are always the products of human meaning making. The meanings and representations come about through discourse, accepted views and an explanatory framework. Discourses become established as a way of understanding society. They're embedded as knowledge. But that's not a neutral explanation, because it carries great power to determine which versions of reality are seen as the most acceptable. For instance, the little boy here in the middle from Cameroon, you might see him as an active social being who plays a full part in his community. You might see him as the offspring of criminally irresponsible parents. It all depends on the view and the discourse you translate it by. In Western society, our view of childhood, our understanding of our understanding of childhood is shaped by two prime discourses. They're contradictory. The discourse of the sinful child, inherently evil, inherently sinful child, and the discourse of the naturally innocent child. These come from religion, from the idea of original sin, that all men sinned in Adam, and this is passed on to children through sin. So it's a religious background, and it's strongly visible in old ideas about childhood. John Bunyan talks about children's sinful nature, prompts them to rebel and delight in paths that lead to hell. We see here the neglectful parents who, by not looking after their children properly, by constraining them, controlling them, are just giving them up to the devil. Good parents, with the support of the church, because children are born sinful, the good parents constrain, control, they curb the children's bad instincts so that they can grow up as civilized human beings. This starts with baptism, with christenings, which is still a remarkably tenacious custom, even though there's such a huge decline in religious belief. We still go on christening children. There's some belief in there somewhere, so that children can grow up to be civilized. A large part of this has always been physical chastisement. Children are physically punished to keep them in control. It's such a part of culture that less than 100 years ago, people on holiday in Eastbourne would be sending postcards like this to their friends. It's a funny joke. beating children. There's loads of them. The sheer prevalence of these shows how accepted the idea was that bad children are spanked. It's what makes them behave. It permeates children's culture from Beano to Billy Bunter. It's a trope that comes up all the time. The idea that children are bad, are intrinsically ill-behaved, is evident in Dennis the Menace. The words that, apart from the fact that that's nicely alliterative, the words that we use about children very often put across this idea, little devils, little beasts. We're putting across this idea that children are bad, but it's in a humorous way. But the way in which that savagery is brought into line is anything but humorous. There are a scary number of books and websites, in America in particular, that work on this idea of discipline and a proper upbringing for children. This is Courageous Christian Fathers. I hope we don't have any courageous Christian fathers here tonight. The little heart up there is from Pastor Bruce Edwards, who tells us that, you know, if you love your children, you're going to beat them. And up there we have an advert, as seen on TV, for a belt. Not to hold your trousers up, but it fixes these terrible sins like talking back, running in stores, not eating, and more. Goodness knows what the more is. I find this really scary. But if the discourse of the sinful child was just a matter of beating children, it would be easy to notice and easy to, we'd recognise it. In fact, these ideas underpin many of the thoughts about children and therefore adults' behaviour towards them. For instance, swaddling. You'll remember from a nativity play in school. Mary wrapped baby Jesus in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. Quite a sensible idea in the days before fire guards and safety gates to wrap a child in cloth so that they couldn't get into harm. The baby Duke of Urbino has rather posher swaddling, being a duke. No doubt his mother didn't have to worry about the washing. And this occurs in lots of pictures about children. I love this picture of the Cholmondeley sisters from the 16th century. Two sisters, babies at the same time, both swaddled up. But this isn't just a historical thing. You get out your phone now and a swipe of a button, you can buy that from Amazon. So we can see that there is a strong expectation that children are prompted to rebel, as Bunyan said, that they need controlling, that they will misbehave. We call it being naughty, which is a deeply ambiguous word that I really don't like. It means doing things that adults don't like, basically. That's a picture from, I can't remember her name because I don't know who it is, but some minor celebrity posted this on her Instagram account. It's the Christmas present that she bought for her son. He was 3 months old. You know, what's going on? This is what she's seeing as the future for her child. And this account of childhood has spawned a whole subgenre of movies. There's the Village of the Damned, the Children of the Damned, there's The Omen, there's Carrie, there's any number, The Exorcist, of these plays that they're on the trope of demonic possession, a fear of evil within the seeming angelic. I've put in, mine's gone blank. Lord of the Flies, thank you. Yes. Lord of the Flies, because although that's not demonic possession, it's the same thing of children if they don't have adult control, they will revert to that savage state. And we get this served up as entertainment on television all the time. Programs like House of Tiny Tearaways, Super Nanny, where for entertainment we see bad children needing a firm hand, or children being left without adult control so that they'll mess up. Because the more mess they make, the better they pander to adult prejudices and the better TV it makes. It's in the press as well, of course. And certain childhoods are more likely to be demonised than others. If you don't have the sense to be born into a white middle-class family, you're more likely to be seen as a problem in the press. It panders to these ideas and it builds on such a prejudice. So, social fear of the young exists alongside the cult of childhood at the same time. So we'll consider this. It's slightly more pleasant, even if it's not quite as benign. It's every bit not benign. Children associated with the natural, usually natural in terms of pretty flowers and fluffy kittens, rather than slugs and warthogs and such like. It's the nice natural things. It's closely associated with religion as the discourse of the evil child, because that is what shaped the medieval and early modern mindset. It comes into a lot of art and literature of the 18th century. Wordsworth talking about the child. We see a complete reversal here, not that the child is born sinful, but that the child is born naturally good, not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory. Heaven lies about us in our infancy, shades of the prison house begin to close. It's the exact reversal of the child who is born evil and needs to be civilized out of it. It's not that the idea of little devils went away, but there's a new emphasis that God's creatures represent original innocence. The idea of a child on their knees praying is the image of proper childhood, the sweet innocent. It continues on into the 20th century. Hush, hush, whisper who dares. Christopher Robin is saying his prayers. It's a vision of proper childhood. So there's less concern now about a tussle with the devil, because if you put your trust in Jesus, then you can be assured of heaven. So the Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking, and it's not just in terms of religion, but the whole cultural imagination was affected by these new ways of thinking about childhood. Children were perceived as untainted by worldly concerns and cares. And this picture by Joshua Reynolds is even called The Age of Innocence. The reforms in child labour helped to shape notions of the fleeting vulnerability of childhood. Diane Gittins says, we see in them qualities of innocence, purity, trust, beauty, joy, qualities that we feel by becoming adults we have lost. Gainsborough's daughters. Chasing a little butterfly, I'm not sure you can see the butterfly very clearly. Illustrative of the vulnerability, fragility, short-termness of childhood. This appears much more natural than the previous posed picture by Reynolds, but it's still every bit as artificial. They didn't trip through the woods in these dainty gauze dresses chasing butterflies. What we're seeing here is Gainsborough's view of his feelings about his children. It's more about emotion. He painted his daughters all through their life. If anybody saw the Gainsborough family exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery over the winter, there's pictures of the girls as they go through right until adulthood. This one he never managed to finish because as he got paid for commissions, he didn't have much time for finishing pictures of the family. Nowadays he'd be putting them on Facebook, but these are pictures that he did for his own pleasure. The increase in literacy meant we get a high proliferation of high-quality children's literature, as opposed to the moralising tracts that came before, sort of biblical stories for children, children's stories about how to behave and what to do. Alice, Water Babies, Peter Pan, Jungle Book. Children are seen as separate to adults in these stories. They're symbolic of a lost Eden, like Mowgli in the jungle. Childhood becomes the focus for adult nostalgia. Because we're conscious that we cannot return to that lost Eden, we have a huge investment in maintaining childhood innocence. It's why evil child movies are so unsettling, because of that disparity between the very unchildlike traits of evil, sadism and murder, juxtaposed against the purity and innocence of the child. There's a great emotional pull attached to the small and vulnerable. And this rhetoric is exploited by the media. In adverts, because it's a shorthand, it carries so much symbolism, but also in news stories. A story about this picture without the child would have nothing like the power that it does there. So it's important to remember that childhood innocence is a cultural view of the nature of children, the nature of childhood, rather than a judgment of individual capabilities and potential. But the slippage between the two concepts of childhood and innocence mean that the consequences are real for actual children's real lived experience. Media portrayals create and reinforce public perceptions, and the image of the child as innocent and weak and vulnerable has a real effect, as does the alternative discourse of an unruly and out of control childhood. These dual ways of seeing guide attitudes and perceptions of childhood and attitudes to children themselves. So, as a result, children are seen either as victims in need of protection or as threats to social order. We live in a time of deep anxiety about childhood, where both those perspectives are visible simultaneously. They emerge in policy and legislation, in media and pop culture, so they have very real effects on children's lives. But children cannot live innocent lives on our behalf. Unlike Peter Pan and Mowgli, they don't live separately, they live among us, and they cannot be better than we are. So, in conclusion, childhood is a social construction, so children can be seen as markers of our humanity. How we view them, how we behave towards them, what our expectations of children are, says much about who we are as a society. Thank you.
Thank you.